Before every season, there's always a betting odds favorite to win it all. In recent years, we've seen teams like the Dodgers, Astros, Mets, Braves, and Yankees get that nod. In 2011, though, the Philadelphia Phillies were easily that pick. The 2011 Philadelphia Phillies were what I like to call a bit of a unicorn. They were something we hadn't really seen before, and that was mainly due to the assembly of the four aces. If you are new to the channel, think about subscribing down below. Hit the like button, the bell button, the share button. I don't care. Hit whatever button you want. And sponsoring today's video is your #1 source for all your sports betting needs, BetOnline, whether that's for MLB, NBA, UFC, and more. Use the code BELIEVE for a 50% welcome bonus. BetOnline, where the game starts. Around this time, the Phillies were experiencing a lot of positives. They had just won the World Series in 2008 and made it back in 2009, but fell short to the Yankees in 6 games. In 2010, they once again had a good team, which no longer had Cliff Lee, who was traded to Seattle, but did have one of the best starting pitchers in baseball, Roy Halladay, whom they traded for in that offseason, as well as Roy Oswalt, who they traded for at the trade deadline. Unfortunately for the Phillies in 2010, they fell short to the eventual World Series champion San Francisco Giants in the National League Championship Series. With a good team still intact heading into the offseason, even with the loss of fan favorite Jason Worth to the Nationals, the Phillies were once again a favorite to be strong contenders in the National League East thanks to a strong rotation that included Roy Halladay, Cole Hamels, and Roy Oswalt. However, they would go on to make a signing that would send shockwaves throughout Major League Baseball. Instead of having a 3-headed monster in the rotation, they decided it was time to have a 4-headed one instead by signing a familiar face, Cliff Lee, who they had traded to the Seattle Mariners in the prior offseason. The Mariners eventually traded him to the Texas Rangers, who would go on to the World Series that year, but fall short to the San Francisco Giants. Cliff Lee, though, had an outstanding 2010 season, going 12-9 with a 3.10 ERA and a 2.58 FIP. While he wasn't his sharpest in the World Series, he pitched extremely well against the Rays and the Yankees in that postseason. The Phillies would now head into the 2011 season with an unthinkable rotation of Roy Halladay, Cole Hamels, Cliff Lee, and Roy Oswalt. 4 pitchers that could easily be an ace of a rotation, which is how they received the nickname the Four Aces. The rotation would obviously go on to be the strength of the team. However, it wouldn't just be a strength, it would be historic. According to Fangraphs, the 2011 Phillies starting pitching staff has the highest Fangraph WAR in the history of the game with a 27.0. Just to put it into perspective, in 2011, the next best starting pitching staff belonged to the Chicago White Sox, who had an 18.2 Fangraph WAR. Let's go over how good this rotation was, starting with Roy Halladay, who finished second in Cy Young voting but had a strong case to win the award over Clayton Kershaw that year. He went 19-6 with a 2.35 ERA and a 2.20 FIP. Moving on to Cliff Lee, who would finish third in Cy Young voting, went 17-8 with a 2.40 ERA and a 2.60 FIP. How about Cole Hamels, who had the 10th highest Fangraph WAR in 2011? He went 14-9 with an ERA of 2.79 and a FIP of 3.05. On to Roy Oswalt, who did battle some injuries that season, but ended up starting 23 games, posting a 3.69 ERA and a 3.44 FIP. Rounding out the rotation ended up being Vance Worley, who would take over the 5th spot in the rotation over Joe Blanton as he was going through some injuries. Worley would end up having a really good rookie season, going 11-3 with a 3.02 ERA and a 3.24 FIP. While the rotation was obviously strong and arguably the greatest of all time, the offense did not instill the same fear. Sure, the Phillies offense did feature some very good players like Ryan Howard, Shane Victorino, Chase Utley, and Hunter Pence, who they traded for that year by the deadline, and some solid role players like John Mabry, Carlos Ruiz, and Raul Ibanez. The offense as a whole did not rank well offensively. They were 13th in runs scored, 16th in WRC+, 17th in slugging, and 17th in ISO percentage. The offense was better in the second half, however, after bringing in Hunter Pence, ranking 11th in WRC+ and 9th in runs scored, but they didn't reach base as much as they did in the first half, only ranking 15th in on-base percentage and 14th in ISO percentage. As for the bullpen, it did have its strengths, but also some weaknesses. Overall for the year, the Phillies bullpen ranked 15th in Fangraph WAR. The top guy was Ryan Madson, who would end up taking over the closer role with Brad Lidge out at the beginning of the year due to injury, but Lidge would return near the end of the season and would be a key factor. There was also Antonio Bastardo, who would hold down the back end of the bullpen, along with Michael Stutz and David Herndon. Other than this, they didn't have a lot of depth, as guys like Dennis Baez and Kyle Kendrick weren't as effective. Again, this bullpen had some strengths, but definitely had some weaknesses as well. Overall, the Phillies would go on to have a very strong 2011 season that saw them win the division with a record of 102-60 and go on to the first round to face the St. Louis Cardinals. The Cardinals would barely get into the playoffs after the Braves collapsed in the infamous Game 162, so the Phillies were heavily favored coming into this series. In Game 1, we would see the Phillies offense come to life to back a strong 8-inning outing from Roy Halladay. In Game 2, however, the Cardinals offense would come back to life against Cliff Lee, who gave up 5 runs over 6 innings thanks in large part to a big 4th inning. They would eventually chase Lee in the 7th after Alan Craig tripled and an Albert Pujols base hit knocked in their 5th and eventual game-winning run to tie the series at 1 apiece. In Game 3, Cole Hamels would pitch 6 strong innings, but the story of this one was a 3-run pinch hit homer in the 7th from Ben Francisco, who only had 6 homers all season. The Cardinals would even up the series in Game 4, however, as they would get to Roy Oswalt for 5 runs over his 6 innings pitched. So it came down to a Game 5, with Roy Halladay taking on Chris Carpenter. Both pitchers put on a classic pitchers duel, but in the end, an RBI double from Skip Shoemaker off Roy Halladay all the way back in the 1st inning was all Chris Carpenter would need, as Carpenter would go on to put on a legendary performance, pitching a complete game shutout. In the end, I think there's a few reasons to why this Phillies team didn't go as far as people thought they would. Right off the bat, they ran into a red-hot Cardinals team who went 18-8 to get into the playoffs on the last day of the season, while the Phillies weren't exactly setting the world on fire, going 16-14 in the month of September. You could also look at the offense, which had underperformed all year and went cold in the final 3 games of the series, especially in Game 5 against Chris Carpenter. Last but not least, I actually think their strength in starting pitching ended up backfiring on them. I understand the rotation was amazing and, quite frankly, arguably the best of all time. However, leaving Cliff Lee in much too long in Game 2 was the wrong move, as he had given up 4 runs through 6 innings and then proceeded to give up 3 straight hits and the eventual game-winning run in the 7th. Then there was Game 4, leaving Roy Oswalt in too long, who ended up giving up a 2-run homer to David Freese, which would end up being the eventual game-winning homer. I understand you want to ride the strength of your starting pitching, but in the playoffs, sometimes you need to turn to the bullpen, and in the end, it didn't quite work out for the Philadelphia Phillies. I also don't blame the Phillies for wanting to ride with their starting pitching, because their bullpen did rank 20th in Fangraph WAR in the second half of that season. Sure, they did get Brad Lidge back in late July that year, but I believe the Phillies would have been able to get by the Cardinals if they had another quality arm to lean on other than Madson and Lidge. In my opinion, Ruben Amaro should have addressed the bullpen a bit more, either in the prior offseason or at least by the trade deadline. Over the next few seasons, we would start to see the Phillies decline. In 2012, we would see Roy Oswalt depart, and we would see Hunter Pence sign with the San Francisco Giants on a 5-year, $90 million deal, and he would end up helping them win the World Series in not just 2012, but 2014 as well. But we would also see an improved bullpen with the addition of one of the best closers in the game, Jonathan Papelbon. Their offense, though, would continue to decline, only ranking 18th in Fangraph WAR that season, especially Ryan Howard, who was coming off an agonizing Achilles tear, which he suffered in Game 5 of the NLDS against the Cardinals in 2011. After this injury, we would never see Ryan Howard return to his former self. In the end, the 2012 Phillies would finish with a record of 81-81 and missing the playoffs for the first time since 2006. In 2013, the decline would continue as they finished with a record of 73 and 89, with the most notable decline coming from Roy Halladay, who would suffer through injuries en route to his last season in the majors. We would also see the departure of fan favorite Shane Victorino as he headed to the Red Sox and would eventually help them win the World Series in 2013. But one of the biggest stories of the 2013 season was the firing of Charlie Manuel after 9 seasons with the Phillies, in which he helped lead them to a World Series championship in 2008 and an NL pennant in 2009. In 2014, we would see the final seasons of Cliff Lee, Jimmy Rollins, and Chase Utley as Phillies, with Cliff Lee eventually pitching his final season due to an elbow injury, Jimmy Rollins departing for the Dodgers in 2015, and Chase Utley, who was actually traded to the Dodgers in 2014. One clear sign that this team needed to move on was a fight over music between Cliff Lee and Jimmy Rollins in the clubhouse in September. That to me is a symbol of how frustrating it was that the Phillies couldn't have won another championship with this core group and the insane starting pitching that they had assembled. While this rotation was legendary, there were definitely some flaws, and in the end, the Phillies, especially the 4 aces, will go down as one of the biggest what-ifs of all time.